Good morning, and welcome to Research Over Coffee. I'd like to start by acknowledging that we are in Mi'kma'ki, the unceded ancestral territory of the Mi'kmaq people. We are all treaty people. We also acknowledge the histories, contributions, and legacies of the African Nova Scotian people and communities who have been here for over 400 years. I'm Laura Hines-Jenkins, Director of Government Relations at Dalhousie University. Today's session will explore behavioral science and its application to government program development and public uptake. We're excited to unpack this topic with you. In acknowledgement of the broad and deep pool of research expertise that shows up in a range of organizations across our province, I'm pleased to introduce today's guests, Mike Davis and Dr. Sydney Breneol. Mike and Sydney work at Davis Peer and Peer Labs, which has a focus on helping governments use innovation, research methods, and rigorous evidence to improve policy making and program design. After Mike and Sydney's presentation, we'll be taking questions using the Q&A function of this webinar. I'll now turn it over to our colleagues at Peer Labs, Mike and Sydney.
Thanks very much, Laura, and thanks to everybody for braving a snowy Tuesday morning. My colleague Sydney's going to put some slides up, and we'll get right into it. Okay, so what we're going to cover today, we'll do a really quick overview of what behavioral science actually is. We'll talk about its application as it relates to social policy, and specifically in and around poverty, and then we're going to walk you through one of the case studies of a piece of applied research that we've been involved in for a number of months now. So behavioral science. So behavioral science as a field is a relatively new and emerging combination, a field of a combination of things like psychology and economics, sociology, neuroscience, etc. It really is, the focus of it is all around trying to understand, influence, and predict human behavior. I think some of the most interesting findings are within behavioral economics or behavioral science, is really that as human beings, we tend to systematically divert from what people would consider to be sort of rational decisions or rational thought. And I guess the power of behavioral science is that if you're able to predict some of those departures, then you can design programs or policies or services that are better catered to us as human beings. So there are many components of behavioral science theory, and so we obviously won't go through all of them, but really just sort of look at the tip of the iceberg. So this speaks to dual process thinking, or dual system process, and it really is, I think, one of the most important concepts within behavioral science. So conceptually, in all of our decision making and thinking, you can think about it this way: we've got these two systems that are always at play, system one and system two. System one is that sort of fast, automatic, unconscious component of our brain and our processing that's happening. System two is the one that you use when or what kicks in when you actually know that you're doing some kind of analysis or making a rational kind of, or trying to make some type of decision. The interesting thing about these two systems is that for lots of reasons, much of what we do is automatic, and probably much more of what we do is automatic than we would be aware of. And so most of what we do is guided by system one, and trying to support system two. So let's talk about that in a little bit more detail to unpack that. So this is kind of the theory of how we make decisions. So something will happen that we need to respond to. So in theory, our system two, what we think is our system two, kicks in. It does some kind of analysis. It reflects on what has happened, and then it determines to act or not act, feel or not feel, as the case may be, right? And so there is a component of our thinking that, if you could think of it this way, we're always doing some kind of cost benefit analysis for things that happen, right? Whether the cost is, financial or time or emotional or whatever else. There's always this sort of cost benefit that's going on. So this is kind of the theory. This is what we think happens. In reality, though, it's much more complicated than that. What happens is that prior to our system two, kicking in, so that rational component kicking in, whatever has happened is reflected upon by our system one automatically, right? And so these mental shortcuts are really there from an evolutionary perspective to basically make it easier to sort of be able to navigate through our day. I suspect that the hardcore sort of psychologists and would suggest that this was sort of the fight or flight type of mechanism that gets us away from saber-toothed tigers and whatnot. But the important thing here is that those mental shortcuts that go back are what we'll call those as biases or heuristics. So they are shortcuts and they're meant to make it easier for us to get through the day. What often happens, though, or sometimes happens anyways, is that we reflect on those as actual facts when they're not facts, right? So system two will use those biases in our decision making. System two is lazy, meaning that it's trying to use as little effort as possible, again, to try to get through the day. And we use those biases and heuristics as facts and then make the decision. Okay? So, and those biases, so there are literally hundreds of scientifically demonstrated and proven behavioral biases and heuristics that have been sort of documented in the literature. We're going to talk about a few coming up now, again, as they relate to social policy. So what does that all matter? So here's why it matters from a government policy, social policy perspective. If you think about all of the work that civil servants do, much of it is designing for system two, right? But as evidence shows, most of our processing as human beings relies on system one. So the way that this shows up is, of course, information alone does not change behavior. So when you think about the context of launching a new policy or a new program, a lot of what we do as civil servants is rely on system two interventions, meaning we put out press releases, we develop frequently asked questions, we have sort of a process that people need to walk through. We try to increase awareness, again, by using information, but that is really only the very first step, right? Context and environment matter so much more than we think. And when I say context and environment, it can be everything from, who the people around us, the temperature of the room, what we had for breakfast. These things all get sort of thrown into a very complex decision-making and choice architecture kind of environment. So let's talk about a couple of those really quickly. So there was a study that was done looking at choice. So in this study, there were two displays of jam in grocery stores. One had 6 choices, one had 24 choices. So from a rational perspective, what you would believe is that if there are more choices, that's going to actually increase the amount of jams purchased. But what you find is that something called choice overload kicks in. So again, one of these behavioral biases. And what will happen is that because of the complexity of trying to make decisions amongst 24 different options, oftentimes what will happen is that we shut down as human beings and we decide not to make a decision, right? And so, unlimited choice, while from a rational perspective might make sense, actually what it can do is it can make us stuck in our ways. Here's another example around incentives. So this was a study that was done by the World Bank in Zambia, trying to increase the distribution and use of female condoms. And so they implemented a number of incentive programs. And again, from a rational perspective, one would believe that that the distribution of anything will be correlated with financial incentives, meaning that the more you get paid to hand something out or distribute something, the more you're going to do that. What you find here, though, is that those financial incentives had very little impact by these hairdressers who were sort of working as the distribution channel. What did work is this recognition program which was sort of the equivalent of gold stars in an elementary school classroom, right? So they got gold stars for each of these condoms that were handed out, and as a result, that program worked a lot better. And so, again, from a rational perspective, you would think that the financial rewards would have more of an impact, and in this case, they didn't. And finally, social identity and self-stereotyping, probably not telling you things that you don't know here, but again, how you feel about yourself has a significant impact on not only your decisions, but also performance as well. And so that's a really, really important concept as we talk about people living in poverty. So just to summarize, I think this is an incredibly simplified diagram trying to summarize sort of governing. And so when you look at regulatory responses, we know that on the far left that there are these education and awareness types of approaches. As you move along the right, there are ways to incent people to do things that, from a policy perspective, is in our best interest and that of the public. And then, of course, all the way over to mandates and compliance. So if you think about that as the system of governing, next slide, Sydney. What we do know is that this type of approach has a strong reliance on system 2, right? So meaning that education and awareness requires us to process information, meaning that types of incentives and the traditional approach to assessing incentives makes assumptions about system 2 as well. It assumes that people are going to be conducting those rational cost benefit analyses all the time, and it absolutely doesn't consider all of the impacts of complexity. And so what complexity, just like those jams, does is it makes it very difficult for us to sort of be able to get through our day. So now let's talk specifically about the behavioral science of poverty. So there was a study, there are a number of studies around a concept called scarcity, and this is one of my favorite ones. So this was a study that was done in India with sugarcane farmers. So the way that sugarcane farming works, at least in India, is that there is only 1 or 2 harvests during a year, meaning that just before harvest, these farmers are cash poor, and just after harvest, they are cash rich. And so what the researchers wanted to do was see if there was if that had any impact on people's cognitive performance. So they did the equivalent of IQ tests and cognitive control tests. And what you find is that the exact same farmers before harvest performed much worse on both IQ and self-control tests than they did after, right? Exact same farmers. And this has been replicated a number of times. And I've replicated this as well in experimental work that we've done. So scarcity, which is what these farmers would be feeling, is a condition that people find themselves in when they have a significant sort of lack of a critical resource like food or income or time. So it causes us to tunnel on that scarce resource and reduces our bandwidth, our cognitive bandwidth, or capacity for other types of decisions. And meaning that the effort that it takes for people to get through for decisions associated with anything else has a considerable cognitive load. And it makes us, as individuals, more susceptible to biases and heuristics, specifically present bias and status quo bias. So again, when you have a significant lack of income or food, say, so many of your cognitive resources, so much of that cognitive capacity is going to trying to navigate a world where you're utilizing scarce resources. And so the analogy that you can think of, which is why there's these two suitcases on the bottom, is that when you're packing for a trip, it's much more difficult to figure out what to take if you've got to take a carry-on, right? Than if you have a checked bag and you can just fire stuff in there, right? And so it's the exact same situation for people that are constantly trying to navigate a world where they don't have enough of something that's critically important. Now, there's ways that we can actually sort of tackle that. So there is an intervention type called self-affirmation. So self-affirmation is, for those of you that aren't familiar, it is something where we as human beings will be asked to either write or say aloud something about ourselves that we find important. We find that it's one of our strengths that we're proud of. So this was a study that was done in a food bank where you would expect that many people would be in scarcity. For those individuals that were given that self-affirmation intervention, which was say aloud something that you like about yourself and you feel proud about, they actually performed better on those IQ and cognitive control tests. And on this next slide here, will also, so same thing was done in a classrooms in the UK for kids that would be on the lower income side, the kind of that left side of the bell curve. Again, they were shown to do better on tests and report lower stress when they were given a self-affirmation intervention. So this really all comes down to empathy for ourselves, and of course the empathy that systems need to have as well. So I think this, just to summarize, and then I'm going to hand things over to Sydney here. There is this sort of overlying belief within society that people make poor decisions, and that leads them into a world of poverty. And of course, what we know is that that's not the case. What we have seen now from evidence is that poverty and scarcity actually reduces our capabilities to be able to navigate the world. And then that is what leads to poor decision making, because we're in this situation of scarcity and cognitive overload. And then those bad decisions create this cycle. Interestingly, one final point before I hand things off to Sydney. So I alluded to a study that I did on replicating self-affirmation. I also wanted to test an intervention that's kind of focused on system 2. So for some of the people in the experiment, the intervention was telling them about scarcity, telling them that they may be in this situation, and then putting them through those same tests, and telling them that was the case had absolutely no impact on their. It did not increase their performance on those tests, but again, that the self-affirmation intervention did, which then further sort of demonstrates the importance of focusing on system 1, kind of our unconscious thinking, versus system 2. Okay, Sydney's going to walk you through an example of how we've applied this to a real world policy situation.
Thanks, Mike. Yes, like Mike alluded to, I'm just going to walk through briefly a case example that we just completed phase 1, which is really exciting. And now we're actually just about to launch phase 2 and in the works of that as well. So in terms of the project objectives and what this project was, is really the overall project objectives were to really co-create an integrated behavioral science research program, which had a twofold objective. The first being identifying behavioral barriers leading to the underutilization of existing income security programs, and also to developing evidence-based and evidence-informed behavior change interventions that are designed to mitigate those identified barriers to the uptake of income security programs. And so most recently, the current government has identified child poverty as a critical issue to address over the next few years. And one issue that this work has really identified is a relatively low uptake on social programming designed to support individuals in low-income households here in Nova Scotia. And so these programs are provided across various levels of government, include both income and non-income supports, and really by all accounts should yield positive outcomes for the recipients. And really there's this large body of knowledge and expertise within the health, social, and behavioral science realm that looks at behaviors in decision-making processes, as Mike has alluded to, of people who are living in poverty. And so really, despite this richness of existing knowledge and expertise, there have been fewer examples of where academics and researchers can really partner and work effectively with policymakers to apply these existing approaches and knowledge to improve program and policy. And so what we did with our project that we're speaking about today is that partners from child poverty initiatives from across Nova Scotia, as well as the Department of Community Services, were really brought together to identify existing income security programs that are targeting low-income children and their families. And so when we started this program, we were actually looking at 4 programs that were both provincial and federal to really explore further. And it was through additional conversations with community and government key parties and actors, 2 programs were really identified as being in direct alignment with our overall project objectives of reducing childhood poverty, and also had potential levers for change, which led us to looking at these 2 programs, including the low-income pharmacare program, which has about a 5% uptake provincially, and as well as the Canada Learning Bond, which has about a 39% uptake, but also has quite a lot of regional variation. So as a researcher, and also from behavioral science and implementation science perspective, how important it is to really define the behaviors and define the problem that we are seeking to explore. So this led us to our research questions. And so really we had 2 overarching research questions for each of the programs. The first being, what are the behavioral barriers to the uptake of the low-income pharmacare program and the Canada Learning Bond here in Nova Scotia? And what are some evidence-informed interventions that might be effective in mitigating these behavioral barriers to the uptake of both of these programs? Then in terms of our research design, so we sought Research Ethics Board approval and REB approval, and conducted a qualitative descriptive research design that used existing behavior change frameworks, such as the BASIC framework, and behavior change theories, such as the COMBI, so the capabilities, opportunities, motivation, behaviors, and combine those with the behavioral biases that Mike has spoken to before, to really understand what are these decision-making processes. And so we were really privileged to be able to speak to about 40 people, so 40 parents and caregivers who might be eligible for the LIPSI program, and as well as 44 parents and caregivers who are eligible for the Canada Learning Bond, as well as some staff who are also in positions to help support these families. And what's really important about this, and Mike alluded to this earlier and mentioned, is that context is so key. And even from an implementation science perspective, really understanding your context. So really leveraging our existing evidence and tailoring that to our context here in Nova Scotia. So these conversations were incredibly helpful in identifying specific barriers and also enablers and biases that might be present here in Nova Scotia. So I won't get into too much of the findings of this research project today, but I did really want to show how findings can also be summarized in terms of this, and also help us understand where these biases might be showing up, and also the potential barriers and enablers, both structurally as well. And so this is really the decision-making processes presented as a behavioral map, which provides information and actions that are being taken. So we can see in the red each step that's involved in actually signing up for the LIPSI program. So it doesn't sound quite as easy as just, well, you just have to sign up and find the form. So it really breaks it down. And it breaks it down further by identifying those potential barriers and enablers at each of those steps, and then further mapping on those behavioral biases as well. So we can see this decision-making processes and where we can start to target. We can also see this for the Canada Learning Bond of really mapping out these processes. And what's really important about this is that the literature shows is that these interventions can be even more effective when they're specifically targeting specific behavioral biases. And again, really leveraging existing literature and existing evidence and tailoring that to our specific context and what we heard directly from families in the community. So the second part of our research objective is identifying potential proposed interventions. And so what's really exciting about this is that this is what we'll be really looking at more in phase 2 of this work. And so utilizing insights from the literature, from qualitative research, from behavioral analysis, we came up with 7 potential interventions that are intended and hypothesized to mitigate those behavioral barriers. And so like Mike alluded to, there are a variety of different behavioral biases. And when we look into the literature, there are interventions that have already been done, and we can leverage that existing knowledge, such as decision aids, such as checklists, default options, and mapping that to the behavioral barriers. We did the same for the Canada Learning Bond. And the next step of this is really refining the interventions, assessing their acceptability, their feasibility, the implications here in Nova Scotia. So really refining those with community and government partners. And so what is phase 2 and what's phase 2 that we're looking at is that we're actually submitting and apply for further funding to launch phase 2 from Research Nova Scotia. And the next phase of the work is really bringing together, like I mentioned, those government and community partners to really refine that intervention design, explore the feasibility. And what's really exciting is the next step will be, and hopefully this summer, is to trial and test proposed interventions to really determine their impact. So it's really exciting that we can leverage these small scale interventions and apply and see their impact here in Nova Scotia. So I will leave it there. Mike, I'm not sure if you wanted to conclude with any final remarks, or we can move on to questions.
No, I think we should open up the Q&A.
All right, great. Thank you both. So I'm Stefan Leslie. I'm the CEO of Research Nova Scotia, and along with Laura, co-host of Research Over Coffee. So for those of you participating today, you'll see the Q&A button down at the bottom of your screen. And if you have any questions or comments you'd like to feed into the discussion, then please put them there. And then I will moderate a discussion with our two co-presenters today. So I'll get things started as questions get added in. And it strikes me, and it's sort of the way you divided your presentation between Mike and Sydney, between the two halves, that there's a portion of this around the research around behavioral science and how it operates. And then there's an implementation science component of how behavioral science can be used for well or not in its application. So if that general division kind of works, maybe I'll start with that first bit and ask Mike what the leading edge of that research agenda is on the behavioral science side of things, rather than just understanding what we already know. What's at the vanguard of that particular field?
Yeah, thanks, Stefan. I mean, it's interesting because it's such an emerging field. It's such a new field, as related to other kind of scientific fields. I think it really behavioral science really grew out of frankly a few different psychologists and economists finding interesting, weird things about how we behave, and then testing those out, right? And so I think that some of the interesting areas of application are probably less on testing out simple biases to see if they replicate, and more about incorporating some of that behavioral research into the more complex context of human decision making and what we would call sort of choice architecture. So that entire system around us. It is an interesting field in that there have been lots of instances where some of these demonstrated biases haven't replicated, for instance. And I think that's a really important point to call out as researchers. And it speaks to the importance of understanding the context that we as humans are in, right? And so it's easy to try to design an RCT, for instance, to test one thing, and if it replicates, then we can get that published, for instance. But it's really, really important to, as Sydney said, look at the entire context, right? Try that in multiple places, see if it replicates or not, and then actually look at, okay, so why did it replicate in one place and not in another? Because that's as important as a finding, an insight, specifically around, for folks that I think are probably on, observing today, that are focused on social policy, because these are complicated systems that people need to navigate, and we need to understand as much of that as possible. So I think that's what you're seeing now at the sort of the front edge of leading behavioral science is, okay, so let's go past the really interesting, weird, quirky things that we can kind of trick people into doing, and actually figure out how do you apply that in a more complex context.
Why did it take us, when I mean us, I mean those interested in public policy, so long to catch up to where social media, at least, but industry generally, has figured out decades ago this stuff is being used actively in that environment for the motivations that they have. Can either of you speak to why we keep focusing on type 2 or system 2 thinking as opposed to that evaluation of the first side, which is 95% of what apparently of what motivates us?
Yeah, I think it's there's a quick answer and a long answer probably, and we have time for the quick answer. I think marketers have figured this out because there's an obvious cost benefit analysis that they can do to increase revenues by getting, if you think about an Amazon, for instance, increasing uptake of something from say 15 to 18%, which is what we're talking about. I think we also need to consider that one of the most accessible kind of books on behavioral science is called Nudge by Thaler and Sunstein, and so they propose a number of different nudges. And of course, what a nudge is it's a slight push that doesn't take a lot of effort to do, but has a bit of it has some impact. For instance, so if you're Amazon and you nudge somebody towards something and you can increase sort of sales by 3%, well, given the scale that they're on, there's significant amount of money there, right? And so they've been kind of focusing on this for quite some time. I think government is a very complicated world where that does not always allow for the amount of sort of testing and innovation, and also the outcomes that we're talking about in social policy are, again, in that context, are a lot more complicated than increasing revenue or purchasing or one individual decision.
So maybe now turning to Sydney, looking at the case study that you presented and the two programs. So with 5% and 39%, I wrote the numbers down right, uptake, seems like there's quite a lot of room that a nudge could have a significant effect. Can you speak a little bit to, and I realize you're in phases in this project, but what you have gleaned from this particular project or case study as it may apply to other opportunities? In other words, what are the generalizable lessons that you're drawing from this work that may be applicable in other circumstances?
Yeah, for sure. I think I can speak to even across the two programs. So when we looked at LIPSI and Canada Learning Bond, it really was, they're two separate programs and they're targeting two separate, areas and factors. And there were a variety of similarities and, even just starting at the knowledge and awareness. And so that was a big thing that came up in both programs of how can we increase knowledge and awareness that these programs exist? And so kind of that step one piece about increasing knowledge. And I think that can be true even at the other four programs that we explored. That was another primary barrier. And when you look into literature, that was something that was often that came up about the simple awareness and knowledge that these programs exist and they're there for folks. And then we move through the barriers, and yes, there are some specific ones, but to what Mike talked about, even choice overload. And I think you can apply that to a variety of different programs and policies that we look at, and using those as key lessons learned. And like you said, those generalizable findings that we can start to apply it. And even when we look into the literature, there are no specific studies that have looked at the low-income pharmacare program, for example, but we can draw upon those generalizable findings from other programs and similar programs. Perhaps they are targeting pharmacare or something in the health or social domain, but you can really start to see those repeated nuances about choice overload or cognitive overload, and how do we simply make things simpler? And so we think about the option of default options and how we can just remove that choice and make it an opt-out option. So I think there are a ton of different generalizable findings that we can find from this study, looking at those two kind of separate programs and looking at even potentially, I don't want to speak, I always get too excited, but looking at other programs and even the other four programs, but I think we can really start to build, and, we're not starting at net new, we're building evidence and we're growing it. And so like Mike mentioned in the previous answer, maybe something didn't go, as we expected, but that's a finding in and of itself. And that's actually something that we can really dive into. And And something that I always like to look at as a researcher is those active ingredients. And so distilling it down to what are those key pieces that work and that we can apply to different contexts. So, yeah.
So who's doing this well? And in particular, so other jurisdictions, other examples in other provinces, either related to to social programming as you've described here, or other areas as well.
Yeah, I mean, there's I would say individual researchers are playing a key role across the world, and we can call a few of those out. Certainly, in the context of within Canada, University of Toronto, Rotman Business School, Dilip Soman is as I think the Canadian chair in behavioral economics. Interestingly, so I just met with him last week. Interestingly enough, and he's in this weird, uncomfortable place of being in a business school, but want to spend all his time talking about policy issues. But he's done a lot to both help the field and grow and also apply. There's UBC is doing some interesting work as well. So that's kind of about the academic place within Canada. So Impact, it's formerly the Impact and Innovation Unit. I think it's called Impact Canada now. The federal government has invested heavily in utilizing behavioral science, and they've done a lot of this in partnership. What actually I think really grew it was applying behavioral science to the public health policy and programming through the pandemic. We saw an increased prevalence there. From a provincial perspective, there aren't many. I know both the provincial government of Ontario and the provincial government of BC have units, certainly, but I think it's a really sort of emerging field. The UK is the jurisdiction that really brought this to the forefront with the behavioral insights team that was founded within government and then spun out, and it's kind of grown all across the world. And it's also David Halpern, who is the CEO of the behavioral insights team, also was a key advisor to spin out the What Works centers in the UK as well, which is another interesting example of not just using behavioral science evidence, but looking at the broader evidence body of evidence that's out there and trying to sort of bring that into the policy making.
Thanks. So so you talked about people are predictably irrational. So it seems to me that really we're just reframing what we consider to be rational, and that people are actually more complicated, and what rational isn't as maybe as simple as we saw it. So Sydney, can you speculate as to what it might take to bring the same sort of familiarity and consistency and discipline that you see around randomized control trials that exist in other parts of the research spectrum into the behavioral side, not necessarily just for the application to social policy or government policy more generally, but just the use of this field in human endeavor more broadly?
Yeah, so I think if I understand your question correctly about, really leveraging RCTs and leveraging different designs, research designs, and further understanding human behavior and predicting human behavior, and also just, I guess I always come back to context as being so important in designing these research studies at the start. And so I think, using our case example as the example that we're speaking to today, of really generating that foundational understanding. And so that foundational understanding, what are those behavioral biases? What are those barriers? And then now that we're going through to phase 2, how can we distill it down? And so how can we, I kind of alluded to earlier, how can we identify those active ingredients? So how can we identify what works well and what might not work well? And I think leveraging different types of designs, and whether, it's an RCT or a hybrid implementation design where you're looking at both the effects of the implementation strategies and also the intervention itself, which I talk about a lot about, of actually distilling those two down of, what is the intervention, what is the program, what's the policy, and then how is it being implemented, and what are those implementation strategies. And so I think research methods have a really unique way of really distilling it down to those active ingredients. And I think behavioral science, when you look into the literature, that's kind of what we're doing too. We're pulling those active ingredients into those active pieces. And so what are the behavioral barriers? And then looking next is, okay, so what interventions are out there that have been tested and tried? And it might not be through an RCT, but looking critically at those analysis and then applying it to our context. And so we might not start with a large randomized control trial. We might look at a pre and post and really, once again, coming back to building on that evidence and building and generating that evidence through a variety of different methods.
Okay, so we're gonna yeah, go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, can I just weigh in on that as well? Yeah, I think for us, so that fully appreciating the value and importance of a gold standard RCT, they can be very, very difficult to do within the real world, real government and policy world. Right, there are all kinds of sort of structural issues and barriers, real ones, that make it difficult to do. And so, I think for us, that's part of the reason that we founded Peer Labs, and try to use as many of these approaches as possible. And as Sydney said, sort of good various research approaches. I think it really comes down to a couple of things. I think it's an investment in small I and large I investment in the infrastructure and mindset behind using more of these types of approaches, not just the RCT to get a paper published in the journal, but to use more of the scientific method in good policy. And I think that the more that we do collectively, the sort of the royal we, the more that we do, I think the more people see the benefits and ask for these types of approaches, and I think we can get a little bit of momentum again without needing to. So I think it's more about, we need a foundation, we need that infrastructure to be doing more of these things, but not letting perfect be the enemy of good in research.
So one of the features of this session is that we try to end sharply at 9:15 to respect people's day, and we could probably talk about this a long time. Maybe the long answers you were talking about, Mike, rather than just a short one, but maybe the final point to Sydney, or question to Sydney in the time that we have left, advice or insight that you can offer for those who now may be familiar or even have some greater familiarity than what you presented here today and is interested in its application. What advice do you have to pursue this that may get us beyond just individual kind of project and very context specific situations into being able to mobilize this kind of research field in service of what it is they're trying to achieve?
That's a great question. Trying to distill it down into a short answer. I think it's difficult to how do I say that? I think it's difficult to forget about that context, but again, it's about those generalizable findings and lessons learned. So I think my advice is look for familiarity, look at similarities. And so if you're looking at, again, defining your problem, and so what problem you're looking at, maybe it is a low uptake. And so looking at these types of research studies and these types of evidence of saying, okay, well, what familiarity and what's in there that's generalizable? So when we think of complexity, friction costs, we look at this program, taking Lipsy as the example, requiring someone to go online, find that form, fill it out, have the prerequisite, have the social insurance number. And then you're looking at your program and policy and saying, I see similar steps here. I see 6 steps involved of kind of getting to that last outcome. So what can we gain and what can we learn? And I think Mike alluded to it earlier about the what works networks. And that's part of actually synthesizing what's already out there. And so looking at what is existing and building upon that and taking those pieces and finding similarities and generalizabilities that we can apply to social policy and programs that might not be starting from net new, but building on those pieces as well. And Mike, I don't know if you have any key lessons, key advice as well.
That's series. That's episode 2.
Yeah. Okay, so we're out of time, and if this plays like all the rest of them, there will be a vigorous and ongoing debate that happens afterwards with people who attended, sending additional questions and requests for recordings and so on, and so we'll continue in that way. But for now, I just want to thank you both, Mike and Sydney, and for everyone who attended to this Research Over Coffee, working through this really important and interesting area. This is our final session of 2023. We'll look forward to additional sessions in 2024. So on behalf of Laura Hines-Jenkin, my colleague at Dalhousie University and Research Nova Scotia, I want to thank everyone for their time and wish you all the best for the season, and have a great rest of your day. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.